everyone please find a seat. Since we're going to be talking about German Jewry, let's be yekes, all of us, and start. If not bidiyuk on time, then very close to on time.
On behalf of the Israel Center, we welcome Bonnie, and we thank you all for coming tonight, and we look forward to being enriched and enlightened.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Before we get started, a little bit of vocabulary, which will make things a little easier to understand, and I won't have to stop in the middle and explain. Two German words which become important in this topic. The first is Reichsvertretung. That is the Reich's representation of German Jews. That was what we would call the Kehillah, or a kind of a Judenrat. It was a representative body representing all the Jewish communities in Germany. After Kristallnacht, it was reorganized, and there was a change of name. And the new name is Reichsvereinigung, which means the Association of Jews in Germany. Notice the subtle difference. It's no longer German Jews, but it's Jews in Germany. And that's reflective of the change of status of Jews in Germany. And so now we go to the youth Aliyah in Germany. Before the rise of Nazis to power, and even in the first few years of Nazi domination, most German Jews simply didn't believe that the Nazis would last. Hitler seemed like a buffoon, like a crazy man, and people thought that it was an aberration of history that would very soon pass. One of the few German Jews who quickly saw the Nazis as an existential threat was Recha Freier. Wife of a congregational rabbi in Berlin, she saw as early as 1932 that there was no future for Jewish youth in Germany. After trying in vain to secure jobs for a group of young Jews who had finished their schooling, she formulated a bold plan, and it's just something that came to her one night. She was inspired by this idea to create, as she said, a great and permanent movement for the transfer of Jewish youth from the diaspora to the Palestinian colonies, to enable them to live and to take root in the soil of their fatherland. Although German Jewish leaders of the Reichsvertretung were skeptical of this idea, this was something brand new, untested, untried. How do you send German youth to be agricultural colonists? No, send them to the university, teach them a trade, but to be agriculturists? Young German Jews, however, were enthusiastic. As Recha Freier said, on the very day the Nazis took office, 30th of January 1933, the Society for Youth Aliyah was established in Berlin, not without a lot of toil and trouble on the part of Recha Freier. She not only invented the idea, but she invented the organization. Single-handedly, she drummed up support, and she created an organization of people who supported her. In March 1933, Rabbi Leo Beck, who was the head of the Reichsvertretung, called all the leaders of Jewish communities to meet to discuss a program of action. It was their responsibility to oversee whatever happened to the Jews in Germany from the Jewish perspective. He told them, "We must face the reality of a Nazi-ruled Germany and endeavor to work out a twofold plan: emigration for young people and the maintenance of the cultural and spiritual life of the remaining Jewish community. So he agreed that they have to help the young people get out. And this, again, was contrary to the general opinion that Nazism was a passing phenomenon. Recha Fryer said, the idea of youth Aliyah, based as it was in rooting young Jews in Palestine, was alien to the larger part of German Jewry and aroused an opposition. The idea of youth Aliyah had first and foremost appealed to the youth of Eastern European Jewry, especially to those in youth movements. Their parents, who had previously been forced once or even twice to take up the staff of the Wanderer, were quick to grasp the significance of events. So German Jews living in Germany of Eastern European origin had the wandering Jew in their bones. They knew what it was to pick up and leave when things got very difficult. Whereas the German Jews who had been comfortable and rooted for generations did not have that instinct. The first group of youth Aliyah left Berlin on October 12, 1932. It was a small group of perhaps 12 young people, and they got Aliyah certificates from the director of the Ben Shemen Children's Village, and that's where they went. Fryer said they would pave the way for the liberation of the others. And then she went over the heads of all the Jewish organizations and went directly to the 18th Zionist Congress that met in August and September 1933. As a result of her bringing this idea to the Zionist Congress, Youth Aliyah became an official project of the World Zionist Organization. More groups of young people followed the first and left to Palestine and were dispersed there to cooperating youth villages, kibbutzim, moshavim, and agricultural schools. As the urgency of emigration from Germany grew, the demand for Palestine certificates for youth outstripped the supply. Does everybody know what a Palestine certificate is?
No.
Okay. The British controlled immigration to Palestine, and they limited it to 1,500 Jews a year at the request or the demand of the Arabs. At the Congress, they added a certain number of special certificates just for youth. So they weren't going to take jobs away, theoretically, from anybody. But even those certificates, the demand for the youth certificates quickly outstripped the supply of those that were available. Membership in Zionist youth organizations was growing rapidly, with many more applicants to Youth Aliyah. However, not all the applicants for Youth Aliyah were deemed sufficiently prepared for life in Palestine. It was not so simple to get a certificate for Youth Aliyah as it wasn't so simple to get a regular certificate. You had to come with your parents and be interviewed and tested on your knowledge of Hebrew, and they decided, is this person ready to live in the yishuv? Does he or she have the skills? Is the person's personality suitable for communal life on a kibbutz, for example? So they didn't take everybody right away. Sometimes you had to wait your turn. And while they were waiting, leaders of Youth Aliyah saw this as an opportunity to educate German Jewish youth about Jewish and Zionist life. We're talking about a very assimilated population who didn't know very much, if anything, about Jewish life. But here they were being persecuted for being Jews, and so that aroused interest in what is this Jewish thing. So the leaders of Youth Aliyah saw this as an opportunity to educate them in about Jewish life and Zionism. What is Zionism? That's something else that they had to learn. Hebrew, they gave them basic knowledge of the Hebrew language and agricultural skills, because that makes no sense to send them to Palestine, where they're going to work the land without any agricultural skills at all. In 1935, and this is still early in the story, in response to increased demand for Aliyah and in response to the dismissal of Jewish children from German's public schools, the Youth Aliyah broadened its project. A Youth Aliyah school was established in Berlin to give the youth a full year's training for life in Palestine. Hebrew was in the center of the curriculum. The main subjects were Jewish history, past and present, Zionism, the labor movement in Palestine, and science as far as it was connected to agriculture. In the midst of the daily degradation of life under the Nazis, and remember, these are children who were expelled from their schools and rejected by the friends with whom they had grown up. There was a crisis among young people because their whole environment had fallen apart around them. And the Youth Aliyah School became a haven for them of comfortable life in Judaism and teaching them its values and its worth. So children who were subjected to the destruction of morale and self-respect went to this school, which was permeated with the spirit of its first head, Franz Ohlendorf. He was a German Jew, a scientist, a Zionist, and a humanist. He had gone to Palestine in 1934, but he was persuaded to return to Germany to lead the Youth Aliyah School in Berlin that would prepare young people for Palestine. And it was understood that this was temporary, but he was uniquely qualified to head up this school. As the demands for Aliyah grew, it became apparent that all youth, regardless of their background, would benefit from preparatory training before their Aliyah. By 1935, Youth Aliyah had two schools in Berlin. One was affiliated with the Hechalutz Zionist youth movement. The other became known as the Youth Aliyah School in Berlin. In addition, the Zionist youth movements established 35 hachsharot, training farms, to accommodate those who were unable to emigrate immediately. These schools and farms accommodated Jewish children and youth who were dismissed from German public schools or who left them in order to escape from the daily humiliation and persecution they were experiencing. To respond to increased demand for schooling, the Reichsvertretung itself opened Jewish primary and secondary schools and sought to ensure that the level of instruction was comparable to those of the German schools. By December 1937, there were close to 25,000 Jewish children attending 167 such Jewish temporary schools, and that constituted about 60% of the number of Jewish children remaining in Germany. We should keep in mind that throughout this period, there is a stream of Jews leaving Germany, and it's estimated that approximately 60% of the 600,000 Jews who started out in Germany in 1933 were able to leave before the beginning of the war. And of those, 80 to 90% were young people. So if we have 25,000 children and young people in the Youth Aliyah, in the Hachsharot and the Youth Aliyah schools, that's a tremendous percentage of those who are remaining. To respond for increased demand of, I read that already, sorry. But most of the schools added a 9th year of vocational study to the mandated 8 years of study. Only 8 years of study were required in Germany for everybody, Jews and non-Jews. So many of these schools added a 9th year of vocational study, and in which they also add the Theodor Herzl School in Berlin added a 10th year of Jewish studies and Hebrew. After 1938, think Kristallnacht, when the demand for Jewish schools and for youth Aliyah certificates increased exponentially, schools were created in youth Aliyah schools were created in several cities, and youth Aliyah opened 11 hachsharot of its own in many locations all over Germany that served more than 500 young people and trained them in agriculture. And some Jewish students opted to attend a 9th or 10th year of school at a youth Aliyah school or hachshara in order to increase their chances of getting a certificate. So if you came to the interview and you had already finished an additional year just of Jewish studies or a 10th year just of Jewish studies, that also increased your chances of getting a certificate sooner rather than later. The youth Aliyah schools were distinguished by their direct connection to the process of Aliyah and by the dual role of their teachers. The teachers functioned both as pedagogues and as madrichim, or as we would call them in Israel, mechanchim, duplicating similar roles that they played in the Zionist youth organizations. Madrichim were intimately involved in the students' lives as role models, companions, and mentors. You all know what the Hebrew word madrich means, right? Okay, so I don't have to explain that. This intangible responsibility to guide behavior, instill values, idealism, and community spirit in the young people, this was perhaps their finest achievement. They created in the youth Aliyah schools and hachsharot a total environment that enveloped the students day and night, weekends and holidays. The schools used the campsites of the Zionist youth groups in Germany, the hachsharot, and their own hachshara sites for some of this programming. By integrating traditional youth movement activities and values with ancient Jewish religious traditions and observances, they created a strong Jewish identity that could withstand the forces conspiring against it and gave the students a set of values that would accompany them throughout their lives. The Youth Aliyah School in Berlin closed briefly in the aftermath of Kristallnacht, November 38, but reopened in May 1939, this time under the supervision of the Reichsvereinigung, which also funded it. That was a major change from before. Originally, the community or donations funded those schools, and there were fees. There was a tuition schedule, but that was no longer allowed, and the Reichsvereinigung funded it out of its own budget, which shrinks as time goes on. 2 schools were opened, one in each of the neighborhoods in Berlin with the greatest concentration of Jews. The Reichsvereinigung allowed youth Aliyah schools internal autonomy and supplied some of the teachers. But the youth Aliyah supplied most of the teachers, who were also madrichim in this dual role, representing a spectrum of the Zionist and religious youth movements. So it was not partisan to any one of the politically oriented youth movements. As time passed and World War II began, many students and teachers gradually left Germany. So we are dealing with an issue of shrinkage. As time goes on, the student body shrinks, the faculty shrinks, and the numbers become much smaller. Franz Ohlendorf also left in 1937. He was actually expelled by the Gestapo, and he went back to the Technion in Haifa, where he became head of the electrical engineering department. And if you Google Franz Ohlendorf, you'll see he was really quite an important person in electrical engineering. Both youth Aliyah schools in Berlin were consolidated into one building, and Yitzhak Schwerzens, who had been one of the teachers in the school and a well-known Jewish scout leader of it, Sophim, was asked to be principal. At that point, the school had 160 students and 11 faculty. So you see a shrinkage already. This is a picture of that last Youth Aliyah school in Berlin, and I hope that you can read the slogan behind the kids. One word is missing, but it's Am Yisrael Chai, which shows you the very strong sense of identity that they had, and they didn't care who saw it. There is Schwerzens in the second row standing at the end of the row of two girls. So what was that school? The school reflected membership in various Zionist organizations. Hashomer HaTzair, the Scouts, Maccabi HaTzair, Habonim, and Bachad, which is Brit Chalutzim Datim. So it's really a full spectrum of Jewish life. Jewish studies, it's very interesting to see what they studied and where the time emphasis was, what got the most time. Jewish studies consisted of Hebrew language, 5 hours a week, Bible, 4 hours a week, Jewish history, 2 hours, Zionist history, 3 hours, Eretz Yisrael study, 2 hours, for a total of 16 hours of Jewish studies. General studies consisted of geography, 2 hours, nature, physics, and chemistry, 4 hours, world literature, 2 hours, current events, 2 hours, music and singing, 2 hours, sport and handcrafts, 2 hours, scouting, 3 hours, for a total of 17 hours. So it's a very rounded curriculum with an emphasis on Zionism and Eretz Yisrael. In addition to these required courses, students could choose electives such as English, psychology, or astronomy, and the total hours for the week, it was 33 hours without the electives. I mentioned music, that everyone took music. This is a picture of a music class, singing. The leader of the teacher is Kurt Messerschmidt, who made it to the United States. He had been the Chazan and music director of one of the largest synagogues in Berlin. This is professionally, obviously, a come down for him, but he was waiting until he could emigrate. He did make it to the United States and ended up as a Chazan in a small town in the state of Maine. So again, no gedulot there, but he was safe in Maine, and I met him at a conference about Jewish music in Berlin, and he spoke about the music and the Chazanut at this large synagogue where he was the director. Who were the students at the Youth Aliyah schools? They were between 12 and 17 years old. Since secondary education was forbidden to Jews over 14 years old, the classes were described officially as supplementary or vocational, not academic. As time went on, the older students were drafted for compulsory factory work, so evening classes were instituted for them for 2 hours a week, twice a week, 2 hours a night, twice a week, and were limited to Eretz Yisrael study and the history of Zionism. Schwerzens said, an attempt was made to create in the evening hours a kind of substitute for regular social life for those who had been robbed of this during the day by the atmosphere of hate and bitterness that surrounded them. By Passover in 1941, these classes were canceled as well, much to the distress of the students, who wrote poignant letters to Schwerzens about it. Inez, 12 years old, wrote to him, "The afternoon class was the only joy of my life. We are trying by ourselves to be good Zionists until we will be able to return to school." Kurt, 13 years old, reported that a group of 5 or 6 friends continued to meet every Shabbat to continue their tradition of Oneg Shabbat and Havdalah together. The Oneg Shabbat, observed in the school every Shabbat from 3 to 7 p.m., was a highlight of the week. The entire school, dressed in white shirts, met in the school's gym. Participation was voluntary, but most students attended, and not only those from observant homes. The program began with Mincha, with the Torah reading. The students led the prayers, read the Torah portion, and sang the traditional melodies together. After the service, there was a discussion about current events, or on an academic topic, which was the theme for an artistic presentation by a group of students. So it was a very integrated content to what they were studying. The program continued with a scout-type lineup at which Yitzchak Schwerzen's teacher and then principal spoke about the events of the past week and goals for the coming week. He welcomed new students. There were constant trickle of new students, and wished departing students well. Departing students was a major phenomenon in the school, because whenever a family could find a place that would take them, they would leave Germany. And at this point, you could still leave Germany. They sang, the school had an anthem, and at the end of the program, before Havdalah, they would sing that anthem together. The anthem was in Hebrew, and it quoted a very well-known poem by Yitzchak Lamdan. Od nimshech lo nutka od hashalshelet, od nimshechet hashalshelet. Mi avot ad banim, midor ledor. The chain is not broken. The chain continues from parents to children, from generation to generation. Many of us learned that poem when we were in elementary school or high school. The official program ended with a Havdalah service, but students and teachers often lingered in order to spend more time together, dancing and socializing. It was a challenge to finally close the gates of the school and send them all home. In the winter and summer of 1940, the Youth Aliyah School in Berlin was able to take 53 students out of the city to spend 2 weeks at a Youth Aliyah Hachshara in the country near Hamburg. They were warmly received by the older Zionist youth on the farm and had an immersive experience in religious Zionist living far from the oppressive atmosphere of Berlin. This was the last opportunity for the school. In the fall of 1941, in October 1941, deportations began in Berlin, and then it was no longer possible to leave on your own. The school was ordered to move to a villa. Right, before we get to the villa, the leaders, Schwerzens and other teachers and leaders, were invited to the Reichsvereinigung, where the head of the youth department spoke to them, explained that soon all their activities would have to stop. And he gave each one of them a plain metal chain. It's the kind that you would hang a key on, or some other kind of equipment. It looks like an industrial type chain. Little balls connected to each other. That's what he gave them. And we will see that that chain reminded them of the Yitzchak Lamdan poem about the chain continues and the chain goes on. So it's a symbolic measure of defiance of the Nazi wish to end the chain, to end the continuity. So they were wearing those chains. Then they were ordered to move to a villa in the Wannsee district of Berlin to do gardening work for the SS, who had taken over the villa from its former Jewish owners. The villa had been owned by the Oppenheimer family, whose name you'll recognize from high finance and other enterprises. I understand they had factories here in Israel. Does the villa in Wannsee sound familiar to anyone? Okay, this was the villa a year later, which was used by the Nazi High Command to endorse and start the final solution. This is where the orders came down, and they received the orders and they proceeded to carry them out. So there's a tremendous irony there, that here was this group of young people doing the gardening work at the villa, which was then used for that dreadful purpose. Since the justification for the existence of the Youth Aliyah School for the Nazis was that it was preparing young people for emigration by teaching them vocational skills, the SS ordered that the students grow vegetables to supply the SS unit that lived in the villa. With little choice in the matter, Schwerzens negotiated a compromise where the students of the Berlin school would work at the villa in 2 shifts, each shift working half a week, and the other half of the week they could go to school in Berlin at the remaining Youth Aliyah school. At least this way, the students would be able to continue some of their studies and would not be subjected to worse forced labor or deportation. The school was now called the Wannsee Gardening School. So no more real school for Jews, just vocational. Schwerzens was the only teacher left in the Berlin school, and another teacher was in charge in Wannsee. The SS officer who lived in the villa left the school pretty much alone, even allowing the students to take home some produce that didn't meet his standards. Under the pretext of studying gardening, the teacher was able to meet with the students after work in a gazebo in the garden to hold discussions about Judaism, Jewish history, and other topics from their curriculum. They made sure to quickly change the topic of discussion to agriculture whenever the SS supervisor approached. The school continued this way until August 1942, when the issue of deportation came closer to them. In other words, since October 41, the Jewish population of Germany was being very slowly and methodically reduced, and the families of these children were getting their deportation notices. Emigration from Germany was banned on October 23, 1941. The Reichsvereinigung was no longer allowed to support the Jewish schools or Hachsharot. Most of them closed within a few months. The Hachsharot became forced labor camps controlled by the Nazi Employment Office. In November 1941, Albert Selbinger called the youth leaders together and gave them that chain, which they all wore as a symbol of Jewish survival and continuity. Now, this very poor quality photograph is in here for a reason, because if you follow, this is Schwerzens and his assistant, Edith Wolf, who we will talk about in a few minutes. If you follow Schwerzens' elbow that's exposed, follow it down, and you'll see the chain hanging from his pocket. That's why I decided to show this picture, even though it's very poor quality. We did an exhibition at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, where I worked, about Jewish resistance to the Nazis, and I tried very hard to get a chain to exhibit. And I actually spoke to Schwerzens. He was living in Berlin at the time. We spoke in Hebrew, because I can't speak German. And he said in his travels, he lost that chain. He has no idea what happened to the chain. So it was a disappointment, but it was very moving to me to be able to speak to him. One of Yitzchak Schwerzen's close associates in Youth Aliyah was Edith Wolf, this young woman in the picture. She was a child of a mixed marriage. She was baptized and raised as a Protestant. But in 1933, she converted to Judaism, and in 1936, a non-Jewish aunt of hers who worked at the municipality had her name removed from membership in the Jewish community. So she now had a valid non-Jewish identity. And because of that, and because of the people that she knew who were not Jewish, she was able to be very helpful to Schwerzens and other people in his circle who needed help to go underground. And we'll get to more of that detail. Edith Wolf first worked with Recha Fryer, with Youth Aliyah, and after Fryer had to leave Berlin, she left in 1939, because the Gestapo was looking for her. Wolf became Schwerzens' assistant at the Youth Aliyah school. Together with Christian contacts, she organized food, housing, and even illegal immigration for Jews living underground. If you went underground, it meant that you no longer existed officially. You were probably using a false identity, but you couldn't get ration cards, you couldn't use public transportation, you were really a non-person. And unless you had these kinds of contacts with non-Jews who would help you, you really had no way of existing. At the end of 1941, Wolf advised Schwerzens to avoid deportation by going underground. He resisted this suggestion at first, but his father was sent a deportation notice in July 1942, and the rest of his family received theirs soon afterwards. Then Yitzchak became convinced that hiding was necessary. The remaining Zionist leadership, and we saw some of them in the previous photograph, approved his plan to go underground and maintain contact clandestinely with others who were hiding. He was even allocated a small monthly stipend to help support himself. Now you'll ask, where was the Reichsvereinigung getting the money? And we'll come to that at the end. They were actually getting it clandestinely via couriers from Switzerland, from the Jewish community in Switzerland. There were people who would cross the border and hand people in the Reichsvereinigung, in the Jewish leadership, hand them money, which came from the Joint Distribution Committee or from the Vaad Hatzalah, and they were able to maintain life, not in any lavish way, but at least they were able to buy food clandestinely with cash. Edith Wolf helped make arrangements for Schwerzens to assume a false identity and find hiding places. And when Yitzchak received his own deportation notice, he left his apartment. A few of his teenage students came and helped carry his suitcases. On August 28, 1942, he disappeared. At first, he lived with Edith Wolf and her parents until his presence aroused suspicion. He then found shelter with a series of protectors, mixed marriage couples, or non-Jews who took great risks to hide him. Schwerzens was the first of this group of young Zionists to go underground. Others followed gradually, and the group was further reduced by deportation. They didn't all get away. In March 1943, they met in Edith Wolf's apartment and called themselves the Chug Chalutzi, the Zionist Circle. Schwerzens considered the 18 months of his work with the Chug Chalutzi his crowning achievement, and this is how he described it. Young people, maturing adolescents, who just recently experienced the violent sundering of their closest family ties by the murderous Nazis, and who never knew where they would rest their heads in the evening, would meet under the trees in one of the forests near Berlin to learn Tanakh, Jewish history, and study about Eretz Yisrael, their distant homeland. They would sit together and enjoy the best of world literature, practice Hebrew vocabulary, and try to speak Hebrew, their mother tongue. They learned and they studied and they learned incessantly. They established a regular schedule of meetings and curriculum and study for themselves. Meeting every day enabled them to keep track of each other. They were all living illegally, and they never knew who would show up to a meeting, and by calling a meeting for every day, they knew who was missing and who wasn't. Meeting every day enabled them to help each other with problems of where to live, obtain food. For that reason, they set up this regular meeting schedule and meeting places so it would be obvious if someone needed help. This was complicated, and now we're going into 43, by frequent air raids by the Allies that damaged meeting places, and by the possibility that someone was caught by the Nazis. This was their weekly schedule. Sundays they met outside the city and hiked to a place where they could play sports or do scouting activities. On Monday, they attended cultural events, a concert, opera, or theater. So how did they do that? How did this group go to the concert or the theater together? Well, they didn't go together. Someone was designated, several people were designated to go to the box office and buy 1 or 2 tickets, which would not arouse any suspicion. The whole group, about a dozen people, would share these tickets, and they would meet they would all go to the theater or the concert at the same time, but they didn't sit together, because a group would arouse suspicion. So that was Monday, where they attend a cultural event. On Tuesday, they studied Hebrew in 2 groups according to their level of proficiency. On Wednesday, they met together to study Eretz Yisrael and Zionist history. Thursday was devoted to the study of Tanakh and resolving personal and group issues. They were free on Friday and Erev Shabbat, but the most important meeting of the week was on Shabbat in the afternoon, where they studied the material that they would encounter in the next cultural event. So if they were going to a concert and they were playing Beethoven at the concert, they would learn about Beethoven's, or they would learn about the plays of, Schiller, whoever it might be, so that they would be prepared to go to this cultural event and understand the issues in the text of the event. So they would do that on Shabbat. They would get prepared for the next cultural event, and they would study Jewish history and a designated topic of the week. They also had an Oneg Shabbat, and they ended with Havdalah. In the summer and warm, dry weather, meeting outdoors was not much of a problem. The group would travel individually or in pairs on the regular commuter trains or trams, and would not be visible in the crowds, especially on Sundays when these trains were crowded with other people on excursions outside the city. As the winter of 1943-44 approached, with diminished numbers, they had to find indoor meeting places, which was much more challenging. When they met indoors, they had to arrive singly or in pairs, not in a group, every 15 minutes according to a strict schedule. They covered the windows with curtains or blinds and observed almost total silence. Instead of singing, they hummed quietly, with no words, expressing all their emotions in the melody alone. The fact that none of their clandestine meetings were discovered is a tribute to their self-discipline and, of course, good luck. Indoor meeting places were arranged in the apartments of families of mixed marriages who were relatively secure from arrest and deportations, usually in the home of the Beck family. Both Beck children, Gad and Miriam, were members of the Chug Chalutzi, and the Beck apartment was usually the venue for their own weekly Oneg Shabbat and holiday celebrations, which closely resembled the observances at the Youth Aliyah school. Once they had an evening, for example, what the programs were, once they had an evening devoted to listening to classical music played on records. Sometimes Schwerzens would describe the pre-Nazi days of the Zionist youth movements, when the youth were free of persecution and mortal fears. Once Edith Wolf lectured about her own path to Judaism. The observances of the holidays were particularly important and memorable. Praying together, Tfilah B'Tzibur, was part of their regular schedule throughout the year. Because of the risks they faced, they had to limit this activity mostly to the holidays, but then it became even more meaningful. Shavuot 1943, in this picture, in the apartment of the Beck family, they gathered around a round table. On the white tablecloth was a pair of lit candles. The candles are on the either side of the picture of Herzl. Again, I apologize for the quality of the photographs, but you use what's available. 2 rolls instead of chalot. Some postcards with images of Eretz Yisrael and a Jewish flag. You can see the stripe there. That activity was not only another, and you see the greenery, a branch of a tree or of a bush, to symbolize Shavuot. That activity was not only another tie to tradition, but it had the added symbolism of starting the counting of the Omer. And they decided to meet every day during the counting of the Omer to count together. So that was another symbol, the symbolism of counting the days until they hoped they would be free. For 7 weeks, whoever could get there met every night at dark for 15 minutes only, changing their meeting place frequently, in a public park, under the bridge, in the zoo, wherever it was deemed feasible. They stood in a circle, holding hands, humming, Hineni Muchanu Zuman. You know what that is, right? It's the beginning of the Seder Sfirat HaOmer. That's the first sentence. Schwerzens would announce the day of the Omer. They would repeat it quietly, and then add the last sentence of Seder Sfirat HaOmer, Sheyibaneh Beit HaMikdash. So this is very symbolic, very heavy laden with Jewish hopes and aspirations, and particularly relevant to their situation. In September 1943, one more of their number was arrested and held in the Gestapo prison, where he was tortured for information. The one who was arrested is the very tall fellow he's the third one in the middle of the ones who were standing. They got a smuggled note from him, assuring them that he did not reveal anything, and that was the last they heard from him before he was deported to Auschwitz. And obviously he did not reveal any information because nobody came after the rest of them. This loss cast a pall over their Rosh Hashanah observance. It happened in early September. Schwerzens, in his memoir, details every single Yom Tov that they celebrated together. He says not a word about that Rosh Hashanah. Obviously, he just couldn't talk about it. He does describe Yom Kippur, though. On Yom Kippur, 1943, they met in the cellar of the Littman family, where they stood for all the prayers, which was said with tremendous emotion and feeling of identification with all of Klal Yisrael throughout history. Recalling the loss of loved ones was particularly painful. Schwerzenz's escape from Germany was meant to be a trial run for the escape of others of the Chug Chalutzi. In February 1944, with the help of Christian contacts made by Edith Wolf, he was outfitted with the documents and uniform of an officer in the Nazi Air Force. No one knew if his escape would succeed and if it could open the way for others. Before he left, he did a very dangerous thing. He copied crucial notes that he had written about the work of Youth Aliyah and the Chug Chalutzi into a small notebook, and he selected some of the photographs that documented their activities, like this photograph. These he put in a folder that he kept with him. If he had been found with that folder, it would have been terribly incriminating for the whole group. There's no explanation as to why he did it. He and a Jewish woman who had the documents of a Nazi Air Force telegraph operator crossed the border with the help of guides who were paid by their Christian friends. Before they parted from their guides, they turned their false documents over to them, hoping that others would use them successfully. Upon their arrival in Switzerland, they said the Shehechianu. They were arrested as soon as they crossed the border into Switzerland. That was normal procedure in Switzerland. The Swiss police would arrest people who crossed the border. They didn't send them back. That only happened at the beginning of the war. And they kept them in internment camps. Schwerzenz immediately got in touch with the head of the Jewish Agency office in Switzerland, who had been sending money to the Chug Chalutzi with these couriers, and the head of the Jewish Agency office in Switzerland, Natan Schwalbe, immediately took him out of the camp and asked him to start a Jewish scout movement in Switzerland, which Schwerzenz did, and he had headed up that scouts movement for 10 years until he made Aliyah. Unfortunately, Schwerzenz's escape route was not used successfully by the others. The next two who tried were caught, and their Christian helpers were discovered as well. One was executed, another was imprisoned, and it was clear that no more escapes would be feasible. Nevertheless, contact with the group in Berlin was not severed. Using couriers, Natan Schwalbe managed to maintain contact with the group, sending money that helped them live. Even members of the group who were arrested eventually were not killed. Now we're talking about 1944. Berlin under almost constant bombardment, municipal and government activities in disarray, and even the deportations from Berlin had stopped already. So anyone who was arrested at that point was just kept in jail, and almost all of them survived until liberation. Schwerzenz reported in his memoir that all the members of the group who were alive when he left survived. After the war, when immigration was the priority, some gained entry to the United States, and 6 others settled in Israel, including Edith Wolf, who had spent more than the last year of the war in prison. She also arrived in Israel and participated with Schwerzenz in writing his memoir. The educational philosophy of the Youth Aliyah schools did not develop in a vacuum. It reflects the best Jewish values, as well as the liberal, social, and ethical philosophy of the time, heavily influenced by John Dewey and Martin Buber, for example. They saw the school as an extension of civil society. They see students and teachers as members of a learning community where each participant is encouraged to exercise self-awareness, to own the ethical and academic material and make it part of his life. It's where the academic material comes alive in the lives of the students. And if you think back to the experiences that you had in school when you were in school, and what was most meaningful and what became part of your life, those are the kinds of activities that were stressed at the Youth Aliyah School so that it would have a lasting influence on a person's life. Just as Judaism teaches individual responsibility for self and community, this approach teaches both self-discipline and responsibility for the community. These lessons were tested in the Holocaust under the most stressful conditions: underground life, arrest, deportation, and worse. These lessons timeless and universal, and as educators or as parents, grandparents, we can learn a lot about how this approach can strengthen both character and community. Thank you. Ha'ikar shachachti. It's not highlighted here. This is the emblem of the Chug Chalutzi. It was drawn by one of the young men who was part of this Chug. And if we look at it carefully, first of all, we see their motto, Af al pi chen, regardless, nevertheless, regardless of what the conditions are. What's important to them? So, tell me what you see in the picture. What you see? Okay, the mountains and Aseret HaDibrot in one of the mountains. Okay, you see a guard tower? Okay, and what's in the center? It's the scouting emblem, right? It's the fleur de lis of the scouts. Now, what?
Geography, the sea coast. Sea coast, the Dead Sea.
Okay, you see the sea coast. Do you see Eretz Yisrael in the middle there? You see, okay, see the Bund, which is Haifa. You see the Kinneret, okay, on the other side, and the Dead Sea down below. So it's a stylized, sort of a map, not too clear, because they didn't want, if this should fall into the wrong hands, they didn't want anyone to recognize it easily. Now at the bottom, what does it say? Chazak. Chazak. And the Zion is breaking the wires. Okay? So, Chazak. We will not remain behind the wire, behind the fence. And this was their emblem. I can't tell you how it was used, but we found it in a publication about the Chug Chalutzi. There's very little about them in the literature, and I just thought that it was very symbolic and evocative of their ideas. Yes?
What's the fleur de lis symbol?
The fleur de lis is the symbol of the international scouting symbol. And they considered themselves Jewish scouts. And Schwerzens was a scout leader. If we go back to the picture of him, look in his lapel. He's wearing the scout emblem. So he was originally a scout leader. Any other questions? Yes?
You mentioned Recha Freya, but what happened to her all those years that this was being done in Germany?
Okay. Recha Freyer had to leave Germany in 1939. She left with her younger daughter. Her husband went to England, and her sons also went to England. I think he took one son with him to England, he was able to, and the other two got out on kinder transports. So Recha and her daughter came to Israel. She had an odyssey till she got to Israel, but she got to Palestine. where she and Henrietta Zold had major personality issues together. They did not work together, but she found other things to do. She was also a very excellent pianist, and she supported music composition and musicians in Israel, and had a major impact on the development of music education in Israel. She eventually got the Israel Prize.
Really?
So she lived in Israel. She is, and her several of her children came to Israel, and Rena and I had the privilege of meeting her daughter, the one who came to Israel with her. So they are part of Israel and very much appreciated. Yes.
You said you worked in a museum?
I worked at the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York City until I retired. Yes.
It's a marvelous museum. Can I give it a plug? It's near Battery Park. It's a marvelous museum. Its location is gorgeous. Somehow it has one of the most beautiful views that I have ever seen, and I've been there quite a number of times, and it is really worth going to if you're in New York.
That's an unsolicited. Okay, question here.
You did more about the year of Wolf in jail. Can you tell us more about that? The year of this lady who was so important.
Edith Wolf in jail.
How did she get arrested? What was it like for that year? How did she get out?
I don't know. We don't know why she was arrested. The Nazis really didn't need a reason. And she wasn't arrested immediately. She was called to the Gestapo, invited to the Gestapo. And there was a big discussion in the Chuk Chalutzi, and they urged her not to go, but to go underground. And she said, no, what can happen to me? So, and she went, and she was arrested and put in jail. I haven't come across anything that she has written about that year in jail. But apparently she was not too badly treated, and she did survive and came to Israel afterwards. Yes?
Is there a book on you for Aliyah?
Okay. This talk is really based on Schwerzenz's memoir, which is called Machteret Chalutzit Begermania Hanazit. He wrote it in German. I read it in the Hebrew translation. A book about youth Aliyah. I don't know. I would Google it and see what you come up with. Okay, but and Recha Fryer also has a memoir, which is the title of that memoir is "Let the Children Come," and that's the background about that whole process of getting youth Aliyah up and running, which I capsulated very, very succinctly here, but it's quite a story. Yes.
Did Schwerzenz attempt to live in Israel after the war?
Yes, he lived in Israel after the 10 years in Switzerland, and he lived in Israel for quite a few years, and went back to Berlin. I don't know why. Went back to Berlin in I think 1987, and died there. Yes.
Apparently there was some kind of a Jewish life in Germany during this period. More than in Eastern Europe, where everyone was just deported.
Well, most of the Jews of Berlin were deported. About 5,000 Jews survived in Berlin underground. It would not be fair to say that there was Jewish life. This little group of people, fewer than 20, created a Jewish life for themselves under those circumstances. Yes?
Where can one get Schwergen's book?
I don't know where you can get. I'm sure it's available here someplace, but I would look in used bookstores.
We can get it from Amazon.
I did not get it from Amazon. I borrowed it from, I think the library of the Jewish Theological Seminary. But I would bet that the Hebrew University Library has it. Yes.
Once Youth Aliyah became an Israeli operation, then it was really under the direction
Of Henrietta Zoll, yes.
And Rechavar was sort of shut out of it.
Yes. She came to, Rechavar had an initial meeting with Henrietta Zoll in 1932 or early 33, when she was just getting this going. And Henrietta Zoll said, I don't have the budget for this. These kids are not good Aliyah material. Unaccompanied children had been a problem in the youth department. They needed a lot of psychological support, and they were not prepared for life in Israel. And she thought it was a terrible idea to send them to work the land, because they came from middle-class homes and they were not appropriate farmer material. She thought it would be better to teach them vocational skills or to send them to university, but she couldn't do it. Her small youth department budget couldn't accommodate that. So she was adamantly opposed to it. The Zionist Congress created the Youth Aliyah, made it official, so she had to deal with it, and she was the one who controlled those special youth certificates. But at least they were available.
Was that
Ironically, Hadassah became the chief supporter
Yes,
of Youth Aliyah later.
yes, right.
What was the question?
Was that because, as Hadassah, she was an official representative of a major organization, and Rechavar worked really basically alone?
Well, Rechavar certainly worked alone, but in the yeshuvs, in Palestine, Henrietta Zoll was the head of the youth department of the Jewish Agency.
Right.
So her responsibilities were very large. In addition, she did a Hadassah medical organization. So she had a great deal on her plate, and she just didn't want to hear about this because it was more than she could handle, and she didn't see how it would be successful. Eventually, it was successful. It was extremely successful. But it also drew on the cooperation of the kibbutzim and moshavim, who were delighted to get this new, young, enthusiastic raw material. Yes.
How many
Well,
children
for
approximately
happiness
did go
goes
through
by
this
then.
process?
Okay, before, and this I learned from Rechavar's daughter last week.
Mariam Landau.
Yeah, her name is Maayan Landau. Before the war broke, before September 1st, 1939, 6,000 young people came through Youth Aliyah, which is a remarkable achievement for an organization of that nature that's just gotten started. Excuse me? Afterwards, I don't know. That you have to. Those numbers have to come from Hadassah. So, yes.
Did you say that as late as 1941 or 1942, Jews in Germany could opt to emigrate out of Germany?
Until October 1941. If they had a place to go, they could get out. Even if they were in a concentration camp, if you could show that you had a visa or even an affidavit to the United States, they would let you out.
Was that true for Eastern European
No.
Germany as well?
No, this is just Germany.
Just German Jews?
It's Germany and Austria. After the war started, after September 1st, 1939, if you were in Eastern Europe, you were basically trapped.
And Vichy France. Many of them
people
came
got-
through the deportation
Yes,
camps,
but
and they were allowed to leave if they had a place to
yes, it was the same, that's correct. Same in France, where in the Vichy zone, there were, in the free zone, there were detention camps. If you had if you could prove that you had a place to go, that you had a visa to the United States, or even just an affidavit from the United States, which meant you were on a list, then you could get out.
The question is, why did the Nazis allow German and Austrian Jews this privilege?
Because September 1st, 1939, the war began,
Right.
and they no longer cared what happened to the Jews. They knew they were going to get them.
But you said Eastern European Jews were trapped, but as late as, you said, October 1942, was it?
41.
41, German and Austrian Jews were allowed to emigrate from Germany and Austria. This was inconceivable. In Poland, or the rest of Eastern Europe, it was closed. Why did the Nazis allow these Jews in Germany and Austria the privilege so late in the war to emigrate?
If Eastern European Jews could get to a place where they could leave, they could. There was no law saying you can't get out, but they were trapped by the circumstances of the war. Many Eastern European Jews fled east. They went to Russia and to the eastern provinces in Russia, and then to Japan. And if they had a Sugihara visa, they were also saved, and they got those in Kovno. So there were opportunities to leave, but they were very, very limited.
What I'm not understanding, perhaps it's not going into my head, it seems that the Nazis gave preference to the German and Austrian Jews. I mean, the Nazis were in Poland from September 1st, 1939, correct?
Yes, and if a Polish Jew under Nazi occupation could somehow cross the occupation line into the Russian zone, then, and if he could navigate the communist bureaucracy, and if he had a visa to go someplace and the money to pay off the NKVD, then he could get out. That's how the Mir Yeshiva got out.
Yes, no, I know that's correct.
Okay, but that's in the same period of time that you're asking about.
The Nazis were in Germany and they were allowing German Jews to go out. So
They didn't care what happened
the
under
ones
their
that were
occupation.
that couldn't cross out of Poland couldn't get out. The Nazi occupied Poland.
But yes.
Poland was tanked on fire. The Catholics in Poland were waiting for the word from anybody, from the Germans, to do what Hitler would have wanted. They were worse than the Germans. And in Poland, my father had told me, they were waiting for the Germans to come because they thought from World War I, the Germans were civilized. But the Poles were the ones who really made ready for the hell that broke out in Eastern Europe.
There was no Nazi legislation in Eastern Europe. The Nazi laws applied in Germany and Austria. What applied in Eastern Europe was the occupation laws. And if you could escape, you escaped. It had nothing to do with law.
But if you couldn't escape, you couldn't get out.
Right.
You were in Nazi occupation in Poland, right?
Right.
But the German law still allowed Jews to go out as late as October 1942.
From Germany or Austria as late as October 1941. It was not an issue of discrimination against one group of people or another. It was an issue of opportunity and luck, depending on where you were geographically. They were ready to let the German Jews leave. The problem was that no country was willing to let them come in.
Right. That's right.
Are there any, one more question, Sandy?
Is there any explanation how they managed to pick Hebrew?
Hebrew was the language that the Zionists preferred. It goes back to Aliyah ben Yehuda.
Eliezer ben Yehuda.
There was a big fight in the Yishuv over language, and Hebrew won out. And so Hebrew became the language of the Zionist movement.
But from the Palestinian Jews who helped, they used to make Aliyah.
I'm sorry, I didn't
The
get.
Palestinian Jews
Yes.
came to Europe to help the Jewish people make Aliyah, and they're the ones who taught the Hebrew language, I presume, in Europe.
The Hebrew language in Europe had a tradition that goes back to the Haskalah, and there were Tarbut schools in Europe where the language of instruction was Hebrew, and in the Zionist youth movements, the language was Hebrew. So while there may have been some shlichim from Eretz Israel who went to Europe to teach Hebrew, I suspect that it was the homegrown Hebrew that fed into the Zionist movement. Okay, thank you all very much.
I want to thank Bonnie for her enlightening and enriching and for really all the effort you put into this to make us wiser and more connected. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Very much.